We are just thrilled to have Os Guinness here with us today. It's a pleasure. He was here a few years ago when the Newt Bar Institute was inaugurated in this very room. And we're excited that he's back on campus for this event and for the Veritas Forum. We couldn't be happier. And I'll let Dean Starr give a proper introduction. But I want to just introduce you to some of our favorite people, Mr. and Mrs. Newt Bar, who are here in the front row, who... They've been so generous in making the Newt Bar Institute possible. You give something to say.
I take the liberty of standing and saying hello, just to show you that even at 101 years of age, we can stand up.
It's always a pleasure for us to have them come up from Orange County to join us for events, and so we've been honored to have them with us today. And they've been so generous in making events like this possible, the international work, and just everything they've done, their servant hearts, their generous hearts in making the Newt Bar Institute, the global justice work all possible. So there are a lot of people, probably most people in this room, have been impacted by their generosity, and so we're just thrilled to have them with us as well. So I will ask Blake Edwards to come up and give a preview of the Veritas Forum, which starts tonight.
Thanks, Jay. Hey guys, thank you so much for being here. I'll go real quick. I need to get out of the way of Dean Starr and Dr. Guinness. Tonight, the Veritas Forum is happening on the undergrad campus at Elkins Auditorium. We start serving food at 6:30, and Oz is speaking at 7:30. A little background on the Veritas Forum: it started in the 90s at Harvard as sort of an opportunity to engage life's biggest questions and sort of inject the Christian perspective and the Christian answers for those questions. A really unique deal. It's been at college campuses all over the country. It's finally at Pepperdine. But tonight, 7:30, Oz is speaking. Tomorrow night, a guy named Cliff Connectley, a pastor from the East Coast, is speaking tomorrow night. So please, I'm sure I won't have to beg you to come after you hear Oz speak now. As if you needed another hook, we have Chick-fil-A tonight and In-N-Out tomorrow night. If you're from the South like me, you hunger for Chick-fil-A almost as much as you hunger for the truth. So please, please come down tonight. It's going to be a great event. That's all I have. Dean Starr.
Chick-fil-A. And Chick-fil-A closes on Sundays, right? Did you know that? Yeah. Well, we are honored to have Os Guinness back with us. It was a great launch of the Newt Bar Institute just 2 years ago. And the Newt Bar Institute is doing so many wonderful things. There are going to be people in this room who, by virtue of the generosity of Elmer and her, will go to places like Uganda and Rwanda and India. There you will serve. You will help build rule of law values. You'll serve, as Scripture says, the least of these. Talk to people about what Newt Bar is doing. You don't need to give speeches because, as Francis of Assisi said, preach the gospel and necessary human words. You just see the actions of these young men, young women who've gone before you. And then some, I think John Napier, now in Kampala, Uganda, who's the only graduate of the Pepperdine Law School I know who has a car and a drive, right? But it's not because of the generosity of the Newt Bars. He makes almost nothing, but it's because of the contribution he's making to the rule of law and mediating disputes, because they've got a broken justice system. Well, we also have a broken world. And Os Guinness, look at his academic background. It is a better pedigree than I could ever hope to achieve. Oxford would never let me in morning. I'm sure they've let almost everybody else here in the room in. But I tell you, he has his DPhil from Oxford, but really that's almost a so what. It's such a great story. He's used the gifts that God has given him in the most powerful way, and you're about to see that on display. Jenny, welcome back to your native Southern California from Pacific Palisades. Join me in welcoming Jenny again. Pepperdine Law School welcome for this distinguished friend, Os Guinness.
Thank you, Dean Starr. No, it's a real delight to see many wonderful friends and to meet new friends. And Herb, And no, thank you and congratulations. I hope I look as good at 71 as you are at 101. You're amazing.
You look mighty good.
No, it's a real pleasure, and to be with you all. Last time I was here, I was talking much more about public policy issues. Today I want to talk about a personal issue for you as lawyers. Because as professional lawyers, you will be in the crazy, fast life of our modern world. And this is one area I think we really have to think through. My background is Irish. In fact, hearing you, Blake, I went to one university where they offered everyone who came free bottles of the Guinness non-alcoholic beer, because they were students. But the place was absolutely jammed. It wasn't my idea, it was theirs, but the place was jammed, not Chick-fil-A. There's a wonderful story in Ireland of a time a Spanish anthropologist went to the west of Ireland where time almost stands still. And he interviewed many people, including an old man outside a pub. And one of his last questions was, in Ireland, do you have any equivalent of our Spanish word, mañana? The old Irishman thought for a long, long time, and then he said, no, we don't have any word as urgent as that in Irish. Now, that was the old Ireland. And then Ireland became the Celtic Tiger and joined the 24/7 fast life that we're all in. And as you know, if you've been out any part of the rest of the world, for example, Kenya, they have a saying, all Westerners have watches, Africans have time. One of the distinctive features of the advanced modern world is the speed at which we're living. We can think of things like road rage, hurry sickness. We can think of things like turbo-capitalism, business at the speed of light, war at warp speed. Slogans like, be first or be last. The Sprint ad, when nothing less than now will do. And you can see this is one of the key features of our modern world. As we've shifted from the industrial age, which centered on production, to the information age, which centers on communication. One of its many features, far more important than the spread of market capitalism, is our immediate, instant speed. Now, we're living in the middle of it. Speed is very hard, time is very hard to think through. You probably know the story of Augustine being asked about time, and he thought a lot about it philosophically. He said, when I'm not asked, I'm very clear what it is. But as soon as I'm asked, I can't say. Like fish in water, we don't know any counter-environment outside time from which to look at time, let alone our modern fast time. So how do we really understand time? Now, we can look historically and culturally at other parts of the world, other periods of history, which were different and give us a clue. But clearly one of the great challenges of our modern world is the speed of our life. The great expert on this, a Frenchman, actually calls this dromology, the study of modern speed, based on the Greek word for a racecourse, dromos. And he talks about dromocracy, the way speed rules our world. And he argues that the faster we go, the less free we are in modern democracy, and many other interesting things. But it's actually incredibly hard to think through. But I want you to think with me today in the light of the fact that in 10, 15 years' time, you as professional lawyers will be in the hurly-burly of a highly pressured world with billable hours and all these things, and speed will be at the heart of your life. But will you be in control, or will you be at the mercy of everything going around you? Let me lay it out in a number of steps in our thinking. First, contrast our modern time with traditional understandings of time. There was always in the past a sense of time as biology. Jenny and I remember an incredible day when we were in East Malaysia, where the giant leathery turtles come in once a year in a week to lay their eggs exactly as the sun sets and so on. And some of them have swum 1,000 miles to be there. What on earth gives them that incredible sense of timing? Scientists tell us today that while we talk of women having biological clocks, we all, not just women, we are biological clocks. And there's a sense of time written into all of creation and all the cosmos itself. They always knew that, there's biological time. But then added to that, social time. Humans are unique for being able to impose on biology our own rhythms and desires. You can think very obviously, say, the invention of gaslight, or later electricity, so we could turn night into day. Or you can think of heroic individuals. One of my heroes, Winston Churchill. He had the capacity to work solid morning and early afternoon, have his hour's nap, and then work till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. And as he said, and his friends said, he was productive in one day for 2 days and got through an amazing amount of work by imposing his rhythms on biology. And that's what's called social time. Some of us are better at that than others, and some of us prefer to sleep rather more, and so on. But you think humans are unique in being not only biologically driven, time-bound, as it said, but sociologically driven. And we can also be time-torn creatures. But then the third feature of traditional time was sacred time. On the one hand, there was a profundity towards sacred things. You take, say, Good Friday. Any Good Friday, say 2009, 2010, is nearer to the original Good Friday in the profundity of its meaning than to any Friday in the calendar week before or the week afterwards. They're secular time, whereas Good Friday or Yom Kippur or any other sacred festival is higher time. Or you can think of the relativity of time religiously. What is one day to the Lord? You all know the answer. For the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. Not to us, but to our Lord who's outside of time. And of course, you also have eternity. And so there was always that great awareness, even in traditional understandings of time, that it was biological, it was partly social, and it was certainly at times, and could be, also sacred. But let's move along. Do you appreciate the revolutionary nature of clock time? Historians say that the clock is the most powerful, decisive invention of the West. What on earth was it about the clock? The clock, for instance, was taken by Matteo Ricci to China and given to the emperor. But the emperors of China viewed clocks and watches as toys, not as technology. And clocks never really bit into the culture of China until the 19th century. What was it? Well, first, very obviously, the clock brought precision. Before that, everything was imprecise. We still use the Roman words AM, PM, ante-meridiem, post-meridiem, before noon, after noon, but that's not exactly precise. Or you think of their measuring devices, say an hourglass. If you turned it over exactly at the right time when the last grain went through and you had exactly the right number of grains in the top half, you could be pretty accurate. If you were looking at something else and you missed it or the thing was badly made, you're in trouble. Or take, say, a sundial. Fabulous if you're in Greece or Italy. But what did the poor Scots do and the Norwegians? And they didn't have any sun to go by. Very imprecise. And the clock, with its hours and then its minutes and finally its seconds, brought precision. The second thing it brought was pressure. Baudelaire, the French poet, talks about the clock as the sinister god that 3,600 times an hour says, now, tick, tock, and so on. And you can see that when the clock began to be industrialized, it was invented around 1400 in Europe, but in the Industrial Revolution, it was coordinated. Think of little trains puffing across continents with big fat railway timetables coordinating everything. Slowly there was incredible pressure, and you had the rise, say, of modern values like efficiency and productivity, let alone billable hours. No one ever thought like that before. Then you had, of course, in connection with that, people like Frederick Taylor, scientific time management. Henry Ford, I give my workers every second they need and not a second they don't need. Now, was he being generous? Or was he being ruthless? People have argued for a long time, and you had the same thing in the Soviet Union with the famous Stakhanov and so on, who was able to turn 5 years of work into 4 years in order to please the fearless leader Stalin, and so on. And you can see in all this, as time began to be written into our world, it produced not only incredible precision, but pressure. And the third thing is less obvious, presumption. As the clock began to be dominant, psychologically in other ways, we began to see things temporally rather than spatially. Simple examples. You take our word civilized. That's obviously a Greek idea. But for the Greeks, they were civilized and the barbarians were not civilized, but it was spatial. In Greece was civilization, and over there, as the Indians would later say, beyond the pale, over there were the barbarians, spatially. Now when we say civilized, we mean people who progressed, and even the word progress is now temporal rather than physical, compared, say, with Pilgrim's Progress or a King's Progress. We've progressed, and we're now ahead in time, and the uncivilized are behind, reactionary, retarded, as the teenagers say, and so on. And you can see even psychologically, time has become dominant over space. And you can see the presumption written in as the clock and watches and modern time began to eat into our Western society. The third thing we've got to wrestle with is the revolutionary nature of advanced modern time. In the Industrial Revolution, there was an enormous increase in speed relatively, and it looks pathetic to us, but relatively. Take, say, travel. Before the Industrial Revolution, the fastest you could go from, say, London to Edinburgh, which is 400 miles, roughly San Francisco, LA, would have been at an average speed of 10 mph. In other words, if you had the carriages, the horses, the inns, the hostelries, everything ready, change your horses, eat fast, and on you go, kind of like a Grand Prix pit stop, you could reach the dizzying speed of 10 mph. With the early Industrial Revolution, that was increased to 15. Now, that sounds pathetic to us, but for the first time in human history, you had a machine dominant over nature. And you had a machine that could sustain speed over distance and didn't need to stop for oats or a meal or a drink. So you can see the first story of the modern understanding of time was dynamism. Time was speed, speed was power, and power was wealth. And so modern speed, even in those primitive stages, was viewed as dynamism. And the faster you could go, the more dynamic and the more wealthy you could be. And that story, of course, is still with us today. The second story was a minority story, was as speed as danger. Speed, thrill, risk, transgression. And that story has always been there. You take the phrase that's tied around James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, although he never actually uses the phrase and it comes from someone else. But if you look at Rebel with a Cause, it's attached to the phrase, live fast. Can you finish it? Live fast. No, you're a generation beyond all this. Live fast, die young. And you can see that today, say, with extreme sports. When Jenny and I lived in Switzerland, we watched the films of the first man who skied down Mount Everest. An incredible feat way back in the early 60s. And you can see today all the death-defying things people do. In an age of boredom, you want thrill, risk, flirt with the edges of things, and extreme sports. And speed's always been tied in with that. Not just dynamism, but danger. But we're beyond that too. And where we are today, of course, is tied in with a world of effortless immediacy. That train that would have reached 15 mph, I remember trains as a boy in the 1950s going to school. You could see the engine driver stoking and the big wheels churning and the pistons going. Incredible effort. Now, click of a button, and it's there. And this is our world. So, think of it like this. In the old days, before our modern fast life, the fastest thing people used to use was things like phrases, the blink of an eye. Today we talk of nanoseconds. And a nanosecond, as you know, is 1/1000th of a second. Now, the old way of saying speed, the blink of an eye, that is actually 500 million nanoseconds. Not exactly fast by modern standards. Now, think of what immediacy, an instantaneous world, is. We, of course, use the word speed in different ways. You can use it of the rate you're traveling or of the rapidity with which you're traveling. So if I'm going 2 mph, that is my speed, although it's not very fast. If I'm going 502 mph, that is also speed in another sense. The word is used ambivalently. And there's an irony in it too. We talk of immediate, and that's right. But you know what the Latin root of that is? Media, which means there is nothing in between. But of course, in our world, there is something very important in between, namely the media. And we're an immediate world which is more mediated than ever before. And you can see many people increasingly live in a mediated world without much human contact, let alone contact with nature. But what is it that our effortless immediacy does? At the heart of it is something very simple. It removes the gaps in human experience. Some of them are very obvious. Instant communication removes the gap between here and there. That's obvious. It removes the gap between now and then. That's obvious. It's instant. Some of the other gaps are more important and less obvious. For instance, the world of immediacy can remove the gap between wish and fulfillment. Take the credit card. Came into America in the 1950s, the Bank of America. One of the first ads for the credit card was, it takes the waiting out of wanting. In the bad old days, you would go to your banker and you had to have something in the bank for him to lend you something to whatever you wanted to do with it. Not today, you just got the plastic. It takes the waiting out of wanting, even if you got nothing. Think of the problems of the mortgage crisis and so on. The gap between wish and fulfillment has been removed. But a very important one is another very simple, obvious one. The world of immediacy removes the gap between one thing and the next thing. Now, that sounds absurdly obvious. You take how long it would take, months, say for Ben Franklin when he was minister, not Ben Franklin, John Adams when he was minister, say in France and Holland or whatever, to send back messages to the Congress. So obviously the news doesn't come that fast and the decisions don't have to be made that fast. But in a world of immediacy, people think fondly of the global village. In fact, for the president or many leaders today, we're not dealing with a simple, unified global village. We're dealing now with the whole world the whole time. And the gap between one thing and the next is instant, and they're coming in from all sides, so that modern information, modern events are like a tsunami. And the poor leader has to be making responses to all these. And all this is wrapped up in the fact that we are the first generation of humans that are living at a speed that is beyond our intellectual comprehension. So the next thing is to think of how we deal with some of the features of this fast life. And I'll just mention some simple ones. The first is what a friend of mine, I think, aptly calls craziness. We all know what it is to live under the pressure of modern fast life. It is crazy at times. Well, what is that actually made up of? Simple to analyze. Partly speed, partly stuff, and partly stress. And the combination of those three, the speed at which things are coming, all the stuff that can come to us, information, decisions, whatever it is, appeals for money, and then the stress that puts on us is literally unprecedented. And we are living daily with the craziness of some of these. Or take a second feature of fast life. the short-sightedness. In the good old days, and we have an eminent historian in the room, in the good old days, people had a sense of the triptych of time, the three phases: the past, the present, and the future. For the average person, they knew a little of the past, kept alive by their family or whatever it was, maybe by good historians, but the past was in the can. They didn't know much about the present, outside their small circle, and next to nothing at all about the future, unless you claim to be in touch with some fraud like a shaman or whatever. That's not us. Many people today hardly care about the past. We're not quite as extreme as Henry Ford history's bunk. Thank God for all the readers of modern history like David McCulloch's and Bill's, Maclay's, and others. But we don't care enough about the past. We now have a sense of instant total information, with information coming in from all around the world if you want it. And we now even claim through quack sciences like futurism to know about what's going to happen in 2050 and all these sort of things. Now, the net effect of that is we're incredibly conscious of the future rushing at us, so we have to look at that moment when the future arrives, which is now. And so our generation is actually incredibly short-sighted because we're focused on the immediate now, which we've got to deal with urgently because here's the whole significance of the future wrapped up in it, and so on. And there's a remarkable short-sightedness compared. I was born and go most years often to China, where they talk very naturally about 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, whatever. And you have books in this country. You may have seen Stuart Brand's, who wrote the whole Earth Catalogue, his book, The Clock of the Long Now, challenging us to think of the next 100 centuries, just as we can, if we want, think of the 100 centuries past. But of course, good luck to him. I don't think most people are going to make their decisions with any sense of 100 centuries to come. The fact is, we're incredibly driven people with a short-sighted preoccupation with now because of its significance as the future lands in our laps. The third common feature of our fast life is the paradoxes. All these time-saving devices, we have less time than before. We know more than any generation in history. Scholars say that the content of every Sunday's New York Times has more information in it than an Enlightenment intellectual would have known in the whole of his life. The simple fact is, among many others, we know more, we have to forget more in order to keep up. And we do. And a deep and profound paradox is many people find that they're moving faster than ever, but it's almost as if they're going round in circles or standing still. And all this is part of our fast life. A sixth step would be to assess the time-juggling strategies we all have living in this crazy speed we do. Take some of the obvious ones. One is a blurring of worlds. Take the impact of the cell telephone. In the old days, there was quite a difference, even in the early industrial era, between your work and your home, between your public life and your private life. But now, as they say, the good news is you can work anywhere. The bad news is you can work anywhere. And you can see the ads, say, of people sitting on the beach in Jamaica, and the airlines or Jamaica want you to see that as a blessing. But in fact, your office in Manhattan or LA or wherever it is with you on the beach in Jamaica, and you're no longer in Jamaica on the beach away from it all as you would have been. And you can see many working people, husbands, mothers, working furiously whatever they do, and then go home, and their BlackBerry's always on. The entire world is available to them. They're accessible to the entire world. And one of the effects is a blurring of worlds. Now, some of the firms like, say, Google, have complained that people then bring their private worlds into their public worlds. So mothers may be texting their kids in high school while they're at work, while the kids are in the classroom. But, of course, the real balance is the other way, that the world of work invades the world of home. And we've all got to watch how our modern media eat up our worlds So there's a blurring of worlds, and everything becomes work if we're not truly careful. Or take another time-juggling resort, multitasking. Many of us pride ourselves on our gifts at multitasking. You can do not just one thing well, or 3 things well, maybe some of you can do 4 or 5 things well. I'm reasonably good at multitasking, but the sad truth is, all the studies show that we do all of them less well. Because many things in life require the love of attention to give real excellence. And if our mind's on 2, 3, 4, 5 things, we're actually doing them all reasonably well, but we're not doing them well. And we should be very careful, the better you are at multitasking, to really ask what you're really doing well. There are other side benefits too. People who multitask often start doing things in odd orders and do them badly and so on. But multitasking is not all the gift that we pretend it is, although modern life forces us all in some ways to be multitaskers. Another time-juggling response is people's resort to surrogate communities. Take all the nonsense said today about social networking. Social networking is what's called in my field, the social sciences, thin community, not thick community. I was just reading recently one social scientist's comparison. He was pointing out that when you had thick communities, in other words, face-to-face living, there were many metaphors all to do with the human body. Combat was hand-to-hand. Justice was eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Discussion was heart to heart. Solidarity was shoulder to shoulder. Community was face to face. Friendship was arm in arm. Change was step by step. Now, if you think of those, there are very, very simple metaphors used about ordinary human life. All of those are linked to the body, and all of those are going. So people glory in the community of, say, Facebook. But while Facebook replaced some of the earlier versions of social networking, which were not so good, you can see today a lot of the discussion, what's going to replace Facebook? Because it's not the next new thing. You've got to go beyond that. And, of course, many people are defriending themselves as much as friending themselves. And they're asking, is this what real friendship is? And so on. And you can see people are beginning to see through the thinness of many of these surrogate communities that come from social networking. Another point we've got to challenge ourselves to is be vigilant about the follies and the idolatries of fast life. Again, let me just take a few. One of them is outsourcing. The faster we go, the more we will outsource things we all did in the past, either to machines, automation, or to paid people. Washington has increasing number of so-called lifestyle consultants, people who will now take kids to soccer games because their parents are too busy to take them to soccer games, and so on. But the expert I mentioned earlier, Paul Virilio, Frenchman, points out the more that we automate things and the more that we outsource to people, the less free and humanly responsible we are. He takes the example, say, of war in America, which the framers left up to which branch of the government? Who was to decide war? Congress, thank you. Congress didn't sound too certain, some of you, but in a law school you should be a little more clear than that. Anyway, Congress. But you can see then war is at warp speed. And the delivery of systems is just as important as the destructiveness of systems. You can see that increasingly the Congress is a rubber stamp, and it's not even just the White House that decides after great deliberation, much of it coming from machines in the Defense Department and so on. And as Virilio says, the faster you go, the less free you eventually become. And the more we outsource to either machines or to people that we pay. There's a loss in our humanness in doing so. Or take a second folly that I think particularly Christians should watch for, and that is the craze for change, relevance, and innovation. Everything in the church today has to be relevant, audience-driven, seeker-sensitive, the latest, and so on, as if the latest is greatest, as if the next the newest new thing is the best. Nonsense. We are great believers in change, of course, new wine, new wineskins, but we're also great appreciators of the continuity with the living past where it's important. I saw a cartoon in the New Yorker, I think it was last year, where a pet owner was looking at his cat. The cat was by the litter box, and the owner was saying, "Never, ever think out of the box." Now, compare that with today. Everyone has to think out of the box. You have to be edgy. You have to think out of the envelope. And there's this craze for choice and change and innovation, which is absolute folly. I was at a big banking conference last year in Europe, and one of the leaders of UBS was saying, and he was talking about this in business, he was saying, think of the most innovative thing we've had in the financial world in the last 20 years. The most innovative thing was the credit default swaps. It was lucrative, it was innovative, it was brilliant, and people made billions through the credit default swaps. But it was also toxic and almost undermined the entire system. In other words, particularly we as Christians should say not just, is this new, is this relevant, is this innovative and so on, but is it good, is it wise, is it right, and not be overwhelmed by this craze for relevance that this modern fast life has brought into our world. How do we finish, though? I think we have to be very wise in building in antidotes to fast life. I'm not a Luddite. I have a BlackBerry in my pocket, which is turned off. I'm not a Luddite for a minute. We've got to be deeply engaged with our modern world, but also critically distancing enough so that we negotiate it with it discerningly. And I want to mention three things. And here again, I think of you in 10, 15 years' time when you're in the hurly-burly of law that you need to have built into your lifestyle. And the first is this: a deep Christian understanding of presence. You know the great Jewish understanding of Martin Buber, I, thou. That our deepest relationship is with God. And when we meet the living God, He is the ultimate presence in the universe. He who is. And we are called to be most fully, most responsibly, most integrally ourselves when we're in His presence. And that is an I-thou relationship. And of course, all other relationships are modeled on that. With our families, with our friends, with our colleagues, and with people who serve us. But one of the features of our modern fast life, and particularly technologies like BlackBerry, is a reinforcement of undermining presence. Now, as humans, we've always been capable of being somewhere and somewhere else too. So I can be listening to the most riveting speaker or preacher, and I can be thinking of my vacation or whatever. We've always, through our imaginations, been capable of that. But now, with our technologies, we can be in one place and not there. And you can see how many people, say Jay and I am talking, and one of us just brings out our BlackBerry, I'm listening to Jay, looking at my BlackBerry, and I'm not there for him. I was asked to give a speech at the huge Anglican World Conference last summer, not this summer, last year, and I was specially asked to warn some of our African brothers and sisters of what's coming to them, that the problems in the Western church are not just Western, American, European, or whatever, they're modern. And I tried to, and then I was amused. We went straight from the plenary which I spoke into a communion service. And I sat in a row in which there were about 10 African bishops, all in full purple regalia. 6 of them were texting during the communion. You can't get a higher, holier moment in Christian worship than communion. But 6 of them were not fully there. Now I have to challenge myself. Jim Elliot, the great missionary leader, he had a little phrase, and long before Blackberries, wherever you are, be all there. The heart of our faith is incarnation. God become a human being for us. And in a world of all this technological mediation, we have to ask ourselves, are we practicing a biblical and a Christian understanding of presence? Wherever we are all there. And we're not letting our modern technology distract us and distance us. The second thing we have to think through, and this is hardest too, is priorities. How do you live in a world where the speed is instant and the world is totally global? So I said, we are dealing, as a leader, the whole world, the whole time. We have to have the focus brought by priorities. I personally think that one way of prioritizing your world is through a deep biblical sense of calling. If you think of a target, bow and arrow, rifle, at the center of a target is the black bullseye. That's where we all live. We all live somewhere. Jenny and I are simply delighted to be here in Malibu today because of the lousy Washington weather recently, but we don't live here. Manila, Laguna Niguel is your center. Our center is Washington, and so on. We all live somewhere. Now, with our influence, we can go wider than that. And there are concentric circles in the target. And we can travel, we can give, we can vote, we can telephone, we can email, we can do all sorts of things. The furthest limit of things we can do is to pray. And we can pray for countries that wouldn't allow us in, or we couldn't afford the ticket to get to there today. But here's the point. At the end of the day, all our circles are limited. Thank God. That's why we can sleep tonight. Each of us is finite. We're responsible for these things, not the entire globe. But if we understand our callings and our focus and our spheres of influence, we put our heart's effort into that fully. And then we hand that to the Lord every evening and at the end of our lives, and we have done our part. I'm not responsible for Herb and Eleanor. They're not responsible for me. I'm not responsible for Jay. Jay's not responsible for me or any of you. But as we each do what's in the spheres of our calling, then we do it to our heart's extent and we can rest, because that's all that we're responsible for. And the Lord has many others doing their thing. And by the power of His Spirit, He's working in His world anyway in a profound way. Think through that for yourself. Otherwise, you'll be overwhelmed. The third thing to think through is disciplines. Again, I'm not good at this naturally. I was taught from day one, coming to faith, about the daily discipline of Bible reading and prayer and worship. But people like Dallas Willard have reminded us so usefully of other disciplines like solitude, like fasting, and all these things which are spiritual disciplines. And if ever we needed those today, it's now. The speed at which we're living. When I was with the Trinity Forum, the discipline which struck most people at the CEO level in the discussions was solitude. And I remember many of them saying how difficult it was from their incredibly busy worlds to spend 2 hours totally silent and alone, or a full day totally silent and alone. And at first, of course, the experience of everything coming into your mind that you should have been thinking of, hadn't done, whatever. And Dallas would say, take a notepad, write them all down, and slowly your mind will begin to run out of things that you should have done and hadn't done, and so on. And as it gets quieter, slowly you're more and more in the presence of God, and you get an incredible counter-environment from which to look back on the craziness of your normal environment. Finish like this. James Frazier, the great anthropologist, used to say, if you understand any worldview of an individual or a culture, you're in fact looking at its view of time. What does it say of our worldviews that we live at this incredible, crazy, breakneck speed that we do? The American historian Will Durant, used to say, no one in a hurry is quite civilized. I'm not sure what he'd say of modern America at the speed in which we're living after he's gone. Octavio La Paz, the Latin American poet, says, "The reformation of any civilization begins with a reformation of its view of time." Now, of course, we as followers of Jesus have the biblical injunction, teach us to number our days that we may live wisely. If there was ever a generation in which wise living was difficult, it's ours. And I would just challenge you as future lawyers to think through, because your field with this, forgive me, I won't make any comments about billable hours and things. You're going into the world that will be in the thick of it. And think through a deeply biblical view of time. It will not only be human, it will be more wise. Over to you.